We are Philippine Expressions Bookshop, dedicated to Filipino Americans in search of their roots. Philippine Expressions Bookshop was established in 1984 to provide a home for Philippine writings in America, as well as books written by Filipino Americans. The bookshop promotes books written in English and other Philippine languages on all aspects of Philippine culture for all ages. Now on its 36th year in Los Angeles, the bookshop blazed the trail and opened new doors to make FilAM writers more visible in the mainstream literary scene. It is the first Filipino-American bookshop on American soil, and it was inspired by a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson: "Do not go where the path may lead. Go instead where there is no path and leave a trail." It is located in the downtown arts district of San Pedro, California, where the bookshop hosts literary soirees such as publication and meet the author parties, book talks, lectures on Philippine culture by visiting Filipino scholars, and poetry readings throughout the year. These community outreach programs are offered free to the public. Every year during National Women's History Month in March, they sponsor a Pinay Gathering to introduce and highlight the works of Pinay authors in the community. During the year, they also have specific programs to highlight National Poetry Month in April, Asian Pacific American Heritage Month in May, with focus on children, and Filipino American History Month in October. In the words of owner and trailblazer Linda Nietas Little, the bookshop is a marriage between culture and business. All around the bookshop and its affiliate, Pintados Art Gallery, Philippine cultural artifacts are displayed to familiarize Americans of Filipino ancestry with the culture of their ancestors. Yes, they sell culture. They also sell books. Welcome to a virtual Pinay Gathering, celebrating International Women's Day, for our Book Talk Series number 2. Philippine Expressions is proud to present 3 scholars and authors, all who happen to be sisters. Joining us this evening for Pinay Gathering is Dr. Celine Parreñas Shimizu, together with Dr. Rhacel Salazar Parreñas and Dr. Juno Salazar Parreñas, who will share their thoughts on Filipina Transnational Feminism.
I will start. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I am going to begin this talk, and I'm so honored and so happy to be presenting with my sisters who really are companions in the work of being scholars and thinkers and writers of books. So thank you for sharing this time with us. It's always so special to be with them. So let's see. I'm going to talk about my latest book, The Proximity of Other Skins. And the origin story for this book is really thinking a lot about Asian and Asian American cultural productions. And what I mean by cultural productions are, theater and movies, and how increasingly they're so tied together, whether it's funding or the people you see on screen or the people collaborating, behind the screen. So it's really a way to bridge between these two areas, so Asian American images are haunted by, cultures, practices, traditions in Asia, and, vice versa, increasingly. So this is my third published just last year. And what it really confronts is something that I'm really in my life, which is sexuality. And in particular, sex acts, what happens in a non-linguistic way, in the way people communicate with each other, how they desire each other, how they love each other, how they find, pleasure for themselves in touching someone else. So I'm really interested in those gestures. And I'm also really interested in, why sex is so tied to love. Does it necessarily, have to be that way, for example? But whatever happens, sexuality is a site of intimacy, where people can really, connect with each other. So one question that I really am asking myself is, if sexuality as a site of intimacy, a site of connection, where people really get to know each other, away from, the public presentation of the self, or the semblance of, who you're performing to be, like, does something get, revealed in the sex act or not, especially about, power differentials. Like, what happens when people have sex with each other who come from radically unequal positions, whether it's, an employer and an employee, a caregiver and the person, they're taking care of, who's paying them to take care of them. So what are these, encounters about, and how can they lead us to unawareness of power? And what do we get out of it as, people who are watching these movies? So there are these two particular movies that I study in the book. And one of them is by the filmmaker Gerardo Calagi. And the name of the film is Those Long-Haired Nights. And what's so interesting about this film is that it's a film about Filipinx trans women, and it's a fiction film. It's called in Tagalog, thank you for the slide, Mga Gabing Kasing Haba ng Hair Ko, or Those Long-Haired Nights. And this film really shows the ceaseless violence that structure, yeah, thanks, we don't need the slide anymore, that structure the lives of Filipinx trans women who are working as sex workers. And so there's a particular relationship, between the woman who you just saw, who's wearing a yellow cardigan, and, a hegemonically attractive man who's a rugby player, who presents as white but is from Sri Lanka. And the entire encounter, between them is always flirting with the nearness of death in the sexual encounter. She doesn't quite know if he knows that she's trans, and is there going to be violence at the end of a kind of discovery, in the sexual act? And the film continually flirts with this. And it plays, with our own fears and, our own attachment, to her as a character. And what's stunning about this film is that it really alludes to the real life death of a Filipina trans sex worker named Jennifer Laude, in 2014, just 3 years before the film was made. Jennifer Laude was killed by asphyxiation. She was drowned in a toilet bowl in a very violent death. And there's a striking shot, in the film, because Tuesday's really afraid, the character Tuesday in the yellow cardigan's really afraid that she's going to be killed by this man, but instead not. Instead, this man declares, his passion and respect for her. But what's striking about the way this film is shot is that the man is so unaware of how fearful she is, how afraid she is for her life, that he could kill her. But she's nonetheless taking this risk in case it opens up the potentiality, not only for pleasure, but for freedom, for, recognition. So it really shows the power differential between them, how he's there for his own pleasure, but for her, there's so much, unknown. So there's, an intense inequality that's exposed at the site of intimacy. What's also really surprising about this film is that it casts not 3 trans women, but it casts 3, recognizably cisgender hetero, men who are well known in Philippine cinema, who are playing trans women. So it introduces something which is, creating empathy for people you already love, who are playing these roles, and it's shot in Burgos, the red light district. And so it's interesting too that there are trans women on the periphery, but then it also raises this question of what does it mean for, filmmakers to make films about marginalized people in our community that does not necessarily involve those very people, in the filmmaking. So you can see that next slide where I talk about, these 3, male actors that are, recognizable stars in the Philippines. And so I bring it into conversation with another film called Call Her Ganda, also made by a queer Filipino filmmaker named PJ Raval. And this documentary is about Jennifer Laude and her killing. And what's really phenomenal about this film is that he really presents a rallying cry of the nation, that protests how she was killed so violently. But what's so special about what PJ Raval does, and you can see in that slide that you just saw, is that he really prioritizes the voices and the activism of Filipinx trans women who are really, so you can see, the people on the top right, you can really see the people who stood by Jennifer Laude's mother and, really made a statement about how their denigration as trans women is, paralleling with the denigration of the Philippine nation state when Duterte, forgave the military person named Pemberton. I'm always confusing him because M. Butterfly is Pinkerton and he's Pemberton. And it's, it's a story about the sacrifice of these women's lives. So the reason why I study these films is I really think about how films are vehicles for us to see and hear and experience our collective trauma and pain. Films are not just sites of education and entertainment, but they really have harmed, our community as well. But they can be the very vehicle for undoing that harm, especially in the way, films can make lived inequities known, and how film can be ways for us to address our woundings and to seek justice and to mobilize action. So the next slide that I have there really shows the various women and men who came forward in defense of and seeking justice for Jennifer Laude's life. And so, thanks for showing that slide. And so to conclude, I'd really like to share that, I work as both a filmmaker and a film scholar. And I think films can really, and the study of films, the making of films, can really help us to find a kind of security and attachment to different images that can help us and to move us away from the insecurities that the traumas of race and movies have inflicted on our community. And it's important to look at how films, if we continually make them and look at them, if they let us imagine something different from what we've experienced in the movies. So, my method of studying films has never been just about looking at what happens on screen. I mean, there's something so powerful, right, about the externalization of the internal, how the expression of a face can express the emotions of a person, how the bodily movements can express the emotions of a person inside. So externalizing the internal is so powerful to see in the movies. And what's also, so powerful is it enables us to see the truths of our society, the hierarchies of gender, the hierarchies of sex that result in the unjust killing of Jennifer Laude. So the films that I present to you, by Gerardo Calagi and by PJ Raval, what they're doing is really prioritizing the marginalized members of the marginalized voices within our community, so that we may experience what movies can do for them beyond just speaking about them, but really making us feel what it means to lose them, making us feel what it is, to love them. So in this way, the way I approach film is that the traumas we experience as a community and as individuals both demands, representation. And I don't believe in the adage that says movies don't affect or don't create structural change, because movies walk into our lives and enable us to act in ways that can create new realities and change our realities. And for these two films that I discussed today, it's really about, thinking about how Jennifer Laude both get to live through the films that Kalagi and Raval have made in her name. Thank you so much for letting me share this work. I look forward to the Q&A where you can ask me more about what I do as a filmmaker and scholar, and my own trajectory in finding both so necessary, to the way I live, and filmmaking brings me so much joy, and so does film scholarship, and being surrounded by the work that precedes me and being surrounded by, students who are creating films as director of the School of Cinema at San Francisco State. Thank you. I'm going to pass it on to my sister, Rhacel Salazar Parreñas.
So hi, everyone, and thank you for joining this evening. And yeah, it's really too bad that we can't be together in person, but hopefully we can still have a productive discussion. And it's really always a joy to speak alongside my sisters. I know it's very unusual that we are three academics in one family. And so there are actually 8 of us siblings and 3 of us. So most of us did not become academics. 3 of us did. And so my sister, she's the director of the film school at San Francisco State University. And I'm just south of her in Los Angeles. I teach sociology at the University of Southern California. And so I'll share with you a little bit about my trajectory, and then I'll talk probably primarily about my most recent book, which is a rewritten, updated version of my first book, Servants of Globalization. And so, as a sociologist, I'm really committed to writing about particularly the contemporary experiences Filipino labor migrants. And so I'm a really committed labor scholar. And because of that, I have to focus on domestic workers because while there are many migrants and while the Philippines is one of the largest source of migration across the globe, the vast majority of women, a little bit about over 50% of women who leave the country as temporary labor migrants actually end up as domestic workers. And so in the context of the West, historically, the largest group of them could be found in Italy and the United States. And so my first book was a comparative, which is Servants of Globalization, is a comparative study of their labor migration and their family life in both these countries, Italy and the United States. However, the vast majority of domestic workers actually do not end up in the West. Most of them end up somewhere in the global South, Asia and the Pacific, Asia, broadly speaking of Asia to include West Asia. So the largest group of domestic workers from the Philippines are actually in Saudi Arabia, followed by the United Arab Emirates. But what's actually peculiar about Filipino, just migrant domestic workers in general, which obviously affects Filipino migrants, is that we could call them legally infantilized migrants. And so across the globe, with the exception of Italy, migrant domestic workers are actually not free laborers, meaning when they go into a country, they are tied to their employer. So their visa status is tied to their employer. So what that means is that they can only work for their employer, who is technically their sponsor. It's very hard to change jobs. In particular countries like most countries and all of the countries in the Middle East, but also Singapore, for example, you need the permission of your employer to quit your job. So if your employer is like mistreating you and you want to leave, you can't just leave because you need their permission to leave the job. So it sounds horrible, but this is actually the norm. And so this inability to re-enter the labor market is something that's not just exclusive to these destinations. You see it to some extent in places like Israel, where you can only change your jobs 3 times during your first 63 months of employment. After 63 months, you cannot leave anymore. You're stuck with your employer in perpetuity until they die, basically. If they die prior, then you don't have a job anymore. In Hong Kong, you could quit your job, but then you have 2 weeks to find a new employer before you can get deported. In Taiwan, you could never quit your job. You're stuck with a sponsor that you were given unless they died or they declared bankruptcy. So if the state says this employer is no longer fit to employ a domestic worker, then you can change jobs. And so that's Taiwan. So Italy actually is not a bad destination, because that and recently Canada are the only two countries where you're not tied to your employer. So historically in the United States, that's also been the case for people who are sponsored to become a domestic worker in this country. It's still true much for au pairs. And then it's still true in the United States. If you come in here with a visa of as tied to a household of an expat. So if you're an expat working in Singapore for more than a year, you had a domestic worker, you come back with that domestic worker is tied to you. Also domestic workers of diplomats. So this is, a situation that I call legal infantilization. And so in the book, Servants of Globalization, I introduced this concept. I talk about like what the ramifications of that for domestic workers are. I mean, we should note that not all domestic workers get abused in this context, but the fact of the matter is they are very easily abused. And so they're often beholden to their employers, and whether their employers are, have a conscience or no conscience at all, right? So in this book, Servants of Globalization, in addition to talking about the legal infantilization of domestic workers that affects so many Filipinos across the globe, I also talk about the fact that most domestic workers cannot bring their children along with them. And this is not just because the nature of the job makes it really hard to raise your kids alongside of you, especially if your employer expect you to be a live-in domestic worker. Across the globe, in most countries, they actually do not qualify to bring their children in as a dependent. And so in a lot of these households, in a lot of these for a lot of these domestic workers, they have to leave their children behind in the Philippines. And so in this book, I talk a lot about what it's like to raise your children from a distance. It's actually very painful for many of them. Some queer studies scholar critique my analysis and basically say that I am romanticizing mothering. It's very heteronormative. But I think that that's actually a very kind of classist argument that doesn't take into account how these people did not really have a choice to leave their children, and that it was not, it was basically something structurally imposed on them. It is a form of violence against them. They don't have a choice on how to raise their children, whether they want to raise their children in proximity or whether they want to raise them from a distance. If it was a choice and they chose to raise them from a distance, then we can celebrate this as sort of a queer household. But I think it's not really speaking to the actual perspective of the workers who really feel this extreme violence from not having, from not being around the children that they want to be around in. And so for many of them, what also aggravates this pain is the fact that they're taking care of other children. And so then having to then displace sort of their feeling of longing for their children, for children that are in their proximity, that they're being paid to care for, that then compounds the alienation that they often discussed. And so in this book, a last form of displacement that I talk about is the experience of contradictory class mobility that domestic workers experience. And so to leave the Philippines to become a domestic worker is not cheap. And so it is cheap if you want to go to an undesirable destination, which would be countries in the Middle East or, Gulf nations. And so it costs them no more than $100 if you want to be a domestic worker. In Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, it will only cost you $100, and it's pretty much the cost of your passport, your medical clearance, various like your police clearance. But then it's so undesirable because your starting salary is likely going to be $209 a month. And so most people don't want to go there if they had a choice. So some people will want to go to Singapore, and that will cost them, it should cost them about $1,800 to $3,000 a month. It's basically a 3 to 7 month wage deduction. And so during the first 3 to 7 months of employment in this in Singapore, people are not getting a salary. And so you could actually say that's a form of human trafficking. And then likewise, that's the case in Taiwan, where it costs them about $5,000, and it's about a year's wage. The cost of migration is about a year's wage, and so people in Taiwan don't get paid for a whole year until, then their second and third year, they start getting paid. And so, but to go to Italy, it costs about $10,000 to $12,000. Likewise, that's the case for Canada. And likewise, in the United States, most women, domestic worker, come with a tourist visa, which is very hard to obtain unless you have resources. And so most of the domestic workers that end up in Canada, in Italy, and the United States are highly educated, meaning they usually had college degrees. Many of them were teachers prior to migration. Some were accountants. And they basically migrate and pursue domestic work because it offers them higher wages than what they would earn as professionals in the Philippines. So that's not necessarily the case for domestic workers in less desirable destinations. And so in the Middle East, most domestic workers had only achieved a 6th grade level of education. Many of them come from very rural areas of the Philippines, and so they're part of that minority in the country that still don't have access to running water or electricity. So it's a very different group, so our diaspora is very diverse. It's a very different group of domestic workers that you'll find in the Middle East versus the highly educated ones you'll find in the West. And so, well, what's the experience for those in the West then to do domestic work is what I talk about in this book, Servants of Globalization. And it's hard for them. It's hard to do domestic work, to be a subordinate, to suddenly feel this decline in your social status when prior to migration, you had your own domestic workers. Prior to migration, you never really did housework. You also had a nanny for your kid. And so suddenly you're doing this work. So I talk about this as what I call the contradictory class mobility of domestic workers. And so then lastly, I want to end by talking about, well, what happens to them when they get older. And so what I found is that they don't really retire. And that was really kind of one of my tragic findings in this book is that, so I did this study in the 1990s, and then it was published in 2001 originally. I was asked by my press to do a second edition and update it. So I went back to the field, and I was very sad to encounter and meet people who participated in my study who were still working in old age. And for many of them, it was because their employers never contributed to their Social Security, which then prevented them from acquiring sort of a pension that they could take back to the Philippines. And so that's the case for both the United States and Italy. In Italy, they're a little bit more consistent with providing a contribution to your pension retirement. But the problem is if you don't work sufficient hours per week, the employers are not obligated to contribute to your pension. And the people adversely affected by this then were the male domestic workers, because it was really hard for male domestic workers to secure at least 15 hours of employment a week. So this is one displacement that men experienced in Italy. In the US, employers are just not nice people. And because they get away with it, they don't put money into the retirement of domestic workers. So let me end there. And I look forward to any questions you might have. And I'm going to be followed we're going by birth order here, by my younger sister, Juno Salazar Parreñas, who teaches science and technology studies and anthropology at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York.
Thank you so much, Rhacel, for presenting me, for Gosh, I am so indebted to both of my elder sisters, Celine, who's the director of the School of Cinema at San Francisco State University, and Rhacel, who's a professor of sociology at University of Southern California. You know, when I was a 12-year-old kid, Celine really encouraged me to find my creative voice and encouraged me to write poetry. And Rhacel was the first person I called when I had my first college paper to write, and she was the person who I thought to help me think through how to write a college paper. So it's such an honor and such a pleasure to get to think with you both, even in this virtual space. And I look forward to the future in which we can be together in the same room, because it's been a very long time. As Rhacel said, I'm in far away. I'm in 3 time zones away in upper in the upstate New York area in Ithaca at Cornell University. So in my 15 minutes that I have with you, I wanted to just answer really 2 questions, which is, how did I get into the book project that is my book, Decolonizing Extinction, the Work of Care in Orangutan Rehabilitation. And then I also wanted to answer this question of what was it like for me to do research as a person who's read as a Filipina and read as feminine, even though I personally identify as genderqueer. So this project started in a very funny way. I had already gotten into graduate school at Harvard, and I was accepted on the project idea of working on self-crucifixion in the Philippines, because I was interested in embodiment and psychoanalysis and what that might mean for understandings of religion and the body and torture. But I happened to watch a documentary right before I was supposed to start graduate school. And it was a documentary about orangutan rehabilitation in Kalimantan, on Borneo, on the Indonesian side of Borneo. So I was super intrigued by this documentary because it had all these Dayak women who are indigenous to Borneo carrying around these infant orangutans. And I was so curious about what they thought about their work, working with these orphaned infant orangutans. But the documentary didn't interview any of them. It only showed the white people running the sites, the Dutch guy who funded the site and the Danish woman who ran the operations. So I pivoted 180 degrees to pursue this new project. So I had to learn Malay, I had to learn primatology to then be able to do this work. So like I did this project thinking I was going to understand how our social relations developed between 2 different species, between people and orangutans, when there's millions of years of evolution dividing these 2 species, and when the orangutan is actually the least social of all great apes. So it was a very intriguing question to me. How do you build a social relationship with the least social of all apes? So I was doing this research in Sarawak, which is on Borneo, in the Malaysian side of Borneo, in the northwestern corner of Borneo. But as I was doing the research, it became clear that the stakes of this project were much bigger, that the social relationships that I was witnessing and experiencing were all shaped by longer histories of colonialism. So, like, of course, I was like focusing on the seconds and microseconds of an encounter between a human and an ape, but those relationships were shaped by decades and years of personal life histories, both on the person side and the orangutan side, because orangutans also have life histories. And then all of that was brought together by centuries of colonialism and ongoing colonialism, even though it was an official post-colony. And of course, then in this backdrop are millions of years of evolution. So that was the reason why I was doing this project. And that's what motivated the book that I wrote. But yeah, but actually doing this research, was difficult, right? So, but okay, it was also quite feasible for me, and I feel like being a Filipina in Sarawak meant I was interpolated and interpreted in certain ways. Like I was read as a Filipina, and so that meant a lot of different things. So for one thing, okay, I will say something kind of funny that in Sarawak, it's a multicultural society. There's like 30 different ethnic groups. Filipinos are also part of that ethnic group, as well as an ethnic group called Visayan. And, my family were actually Visayan, right? So the largest Dayak indigenous ethnic group is Iban. And Iban and Tagalog have a lot of overlap. So the word aso is the same, dog. The word manok is the same, just chicken. And there's also like a cognate word, like a lot of cognate words, but one that I remember the most is like bunso, which is, in Tagalog, it's the youngest sibling. In Iban, it's bunsu. So you can kind of imagine, like I would imagine this, that like our seafaring ancestors, because we're all like Austronesian speakers in Southeast Asia, like our seafaring ancestors had really prioritized their dog, their chicken, and their youngest child. So yeah, okay, that's like so random. But anyway, so as like this person who is like local, not local, you know, like there's a lot of Filipinos who migrate and who end up in Sarawak. Of course, I was asked if I could sing. I cannot sing. I could not sing to save my life. But my being Filipina meant people would often disclose things to me that they wouldn't disclose to others. So, for instance, as just an example from my research, I was talking with a Bidayu interlocutor of mine. Bidayu is one of the other indigenous ethnic groups in Sarawak. And he was just telling me off the cuff that, the police here are armed like the military in other countries. Then he immediately said, but it's worse in the Philippines, isn't it? So, like, granted, what he was saying was at this moment of the pretty, like, that really horrific massacre that had happened in Mindanao in 2009, in late 2009. It was the Ampatuan Massacre, in which it was detailed in news media what had happened to this party of journalists following a politician, and how his enemy had attacked the convoy and brutally assaulted and murdered like women journalists who were just following this group, and the women who are part of this party of this convoy. So those kinds of details were widely distributed this is like before social media was really so significant. It was like in news media, right? So then this stereotype of the Philippines' brutality often served as a foil against which people could complain to me about Sarawak. So yeah, so okay, when I was actually doing my fieldwork was set in the very, very far outskirts of the city. And being an urban person at heart, I felt like I needed to escape once in a while, to get like my dirty city air, and to like feel, to get to be like another sense of self that I didn't get to express while doing my field research. Because when I was doing my actual field research, I was very much falling into pretty deep and conservative gender expectations, just because it's easier to play it safe than it is to not play it safe, when my safety really depends on people who don't know me well. So it's better to play modesty and to just not and to like find the protection of others in ways that are not like too compromising. So yeah, I needed to find time to get to the city. So what I would do is that I would um, uh, choose between one of the van drivers who would regularly go to the city. And my favorite van driver, I ended up finding out, had a history of having dressed as a woman and lived as a woman for years before he, and he's gendered as masculine, before he ended up leaving to become a logger in Papua in the 1980s. And then he came back and then he married a woman and they had children and he fell into a heteronormative life. So it's noteworthy that I felt the most safe with him, in my, like 2-hour drives to the city. So this is just to say, like, queer people are everywhere, and that these queer histories, queer personal histories, and queer life histories matter, even as the life that you live now looks different. So let's see what else. In the city, I did befriend folks with whom I could be extremely honest about who I am and who I was. And yeah, and I'm just like super grateful, for that circle of friends who adopted me. Yeah, let's see. Um, so my career so far has been really devoted to human animal studies. Uh, Partially because I feel like I've had the place and encouragement to really explore what I think matters. And so for me, Celine has made it so clear that films change the world. Rhacel, as a sociologist, shows like the real plight of Filipino workers. And with mine, I look at the environment, and particularly animals in the environment, as a way to talk about, in my first book, the Sixth Extinction, this moment of mass dying in which we're in which uh, um, the losses of this planet are so great that it's become part of the stratigraphic record of Earth. With my newer work, it's funny, my sister Rhacel has pointed out how Filipina domestic workers don't have the opportunity to retire. But in my work, I'm seeing animals who get to retire. And so animal retirement is emerging as a new phenomenon right when humans, of different kinds of humans, are not able to retire. And so I'm exploring what that is and what it is to care for other species, when you don't actually have the full knowledge around these species, that these, like certain species like domestic cows and chimpanzees, are living lives far longer than their expected lifespans. And so then it comes to open a new kind of expertise, of a new kind of knowledge of how do you care for a geriatric being for whom there isn't any guidebooks on how to care for that geriatric being. So yeah, it's strange that, on the surface, it looks like we work on such different things, but we're still really committed to these ideas of care and intimacies. Yeah, so that's it for me. I look forward to spending time with my sisters together on screen and thinking with them in a virtual space.
We don't have any questions yet. So let me ask Juno a question. Tell me more about the retirement of animals. So who is allowing them to retire? And where are you going to do this study on the retirement of animals?
Thanks, Rhacel. trying to figure out how I can get back to Southeast Asia, because my job, I'm a program affiliate for Southeast Asian Studies. And so like my first book is so deeply Southeast Asian studies, like I talk about being a Filipina, doing work in Malaysia, and then like I talk about the Cold War, like all these things that are so deeply Southeast Asian. And so it's very weird to develop a project that doesn't have Southeast Asia in it yet. So far, I've done research in South Africa with retired circus lions. And I've done research in Germany on retired dairy cows. And I'm hoping to get to do some research in upstate New York on retired farm animals, also dairy cows, but some chickens and pigs. but yeah, so the Southeast Asia part is a little weird because everything else, except for the lions, these are like domestic animals, ex-circus animals. I'm hoping to actually do work in Singapore because the Singapore Zoo is the leader of geriatric veterinary medicine. Oh. And it's the interest is to keep their zoo animals alive as long as possible, to not have to like buy new animals from the wild, which you can't really do anymore. And to not have to to try to like prolong their longevity as long as possible.
So we have one question for Celine from Francesca McNeil. Francesca McNeil would like to know what are the effects of these films after their viewing, as they have used, like, basically talk about how you could see the question here, perceptions of trans in the Philippines.
It's thank you so much for the question. It's hard to measure, but if you do an easy Google search just on Those Long-Haired Nights or Gerardo Calagi, the filmmaker, you'll see that there have been a lot of various public, fora online that includes conversations, between the actors about their own transformations, having played these roles, having conducted the research to play these roles, and the rising up of, compassion and empathy for the particular plight that these women faced that they really did not know about. Having studied, the audience, with whom I viewed the film the 4 times when we can be in the theater, you can really feel in the crowd this heightened sense of fear at what was going to happen, to the 3 main women, that the film was focused on. And it was a continual, teasing of violence that never happened, and it makes you aware of the way in which, many Western films featuring trans people always involve violence, typically lead to, death. And the film tries to undo that and really made for a kind of horrific experience, and also a learning one for understanding the different, values that are at play that shape the way we receive movies and make movies about particular people. Thank you for the question.
Thanks so much, Celine. I was thinking about when I watched Pose for the first time, just being so afraid of a pending murder. Mm-hmm. I'm so excited that there's a movie from the Philippines that plays with that whole tension and sustains it. Yeah, it's so interesting what you're saying. But I have a question for you both. Okay, was there a moment in your life where you became a feminist? When was that moment?
Well, I guess for me, that question is so tied to being an older sister, of 7 sisters, right? And, really I guess 2 things, the expectation, the violence of low expectation. And also, I think the need to, share that we can achieve things, and that we can be freed from a patriarchal home, so we can live how we want. I mean, like seeing you, Juno, grow up as a queer child, and wanting to make sure that there were narratives, that would protect you, like growing up, so, and I think, for me and Rhacel, I mean, just running around, yeah, looking for opportunity to get out, Rhacel.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I didn't really take like gender studies classes when I was an undergrad. I think I actually only took one, and that was with Trinity Minha when I was like a junior, I think. And it was like a seminar. And the only reason why I took it, obviously, because she was like a woman of color feminist. And so, but when I was at Berkeley as an undergrad, I was a peace and conflict studies major. And there was no labor studies major, but then you had to focus on a specialty. And it was interesting because I knew I wanted to study women in work. So then I was kind of just floating around the campus looking for any class that could help me better understand women in work. It wasn't until I think my senior year that there was actually a class called Women in Work.
Wow.
And that was also in gender studies. But yeah, and so then I think, so for me, I come to this identity as a feminist, not so much from my personal experience. I mean, maybe it is, but really I was always just so concerned about women's plight in the labor force, and the inequalities in the labor force. And then just because I'm Filipino, I thought it was really important to also write about Filipino women's experiences in the workforce, especially because when I was going to undergrad, there was really no books written by Filipino American academics on the Philippines or Filipino Americans that were contemporary. There was like a few historical studies by people like Vincent Raphael, the people from Cornell, people from Madison that are historians mostly. So for me, it was just really important to document the working experiences of women. And as a Filipino, I was committed to writing about Filipino Americans.
How about you, Juno?
For me, it's funny because, as you both know, I did poorly in high school. Like I got like D's. It's so funny, right? Because I'm the one who went to Harvard, but I totally had D's in high school. And all that time, I kept thinking, as long as I survive high school, I can be a women's studies major. Which is, what happened at Santa Cruz for me. But yeah, like when that pivotal moment was, like I think I can't dissociate it from my coming out. And I remember coming out to you when I was like 11 or 10, Celine, like calling you from Tita Evil's house, which is like horrible because it's like that phone bill, Because
so we have a question. I want to get
okay, we do have a question.
People in the audience.
Yeah, so Shalimar Zabanal Verador asks.
She wants us to basically talk about, for those of us interested in learning more about Filipino feminist intersectionality issues and what women mentors and inspired you to get into your work. So, yeah, like what inspired you? Who inspired you?
Quickly, I'll say there's Nefertiti Tadiar's book. There's her two books, Nefertiti Tadiar. Yeah, those were personally really inspiring for me, and I did coursework with her before she went to Barnard. And for me, it was Anna Singh, who's an anthropologist who works in Borneo, but that's obvious, right? For me. But there's that other book, Pinay Power, right?
Yeah.
Like mid-2000s? Or is it 99 or 2000?
Melinda De Jesus' book, Pinay Power, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. What other resources can you think of that are like about Filipina intersectional feminism? And like your work, Celine, and your work, Rhacel. Like, I can't believe your college paper, Rhacel. Like your Brown Monkeys paper, so influential. Like for me, for my thinking.
So I mean, I think that for me, when I was like getting educated as a feminist and to really be attuned to the different experiences women of color had, I must say that I was really influenced a lot by Bell Hook's work, and her experiences of like really talking about her, like how her experiences are different from Black men and white women, like really helped me see the different positionalities that Filipino women would have vis-a-vis other men in their community, So I would say bell hooks was really like very, very formative in my thinking. And then I should also say that, when I started writing about Filipino domestic workers, this book, Servants of Globalization, it has sold like more than 10,000 copies, which is very unusual for an academic book. But when I was first like looking for a press, I remember I would peddle the proposal and I got a response, or a couple of times I got the response, your topic is too narrow to generate any kind of wider interest, that we can't like invest in this project. So one of those presses is, for example, Temple University Press. And and to write about this narrow topic, Filipino domestic workers, was just like presses wouldn't publish it. But what really motivated me and what really like got me kind of to push along was that my mentor, Evelyn Akano Glenn, wrote a book about 3 generations of Japanese American domestic workers. So I knew it was possible. I knew I could write about Filipino domestic workers, but because she wrote about Japanese domestic workers, and I just persisted, and I found a press, and the book sold really well, and there was a movie made about the book, and I'm tenured because of the book, and so then for the grad students in the audience, just like follow your passion. Do not sort of feel like you can't do this, like it's too narrow of a topic, no one's interested in Filipinos, and that shouldn't really set you back.
So we have sorry, Celine, please.
Yeah, similarly, I was at UC Berkeley as an undergrad, in the heyday of so many women of color faculty members, and the professor who supervised my senior thesis was Trinity Minha, who's a filmmaker and scholar in the academy. And I think like Rhacel, like the model of being both a filmmaker and a scholar, she really enabled in me. And training with Lonnie Ding on first becoming how to become a filmmaker, and scholars like Sheree Moraga. And I think I would go back to the anthology This Bridge Called My Back, to think about what you're asking about women of color politics.
So we have 2 questions. One is from our niece. What made you decide you wanted to be a professor? And the other question is actually the other question's a little more complicated. So how about one?
Inform each other.
Yeah.
I think maybe only one of us should answer one question because we only have 2 minutes.
Yeah.
I can answer why I became a professor, because I was like waiting for inflation to hit. I had $7,000 in student loans graduating from Berkeley in 1992. And for me, that was like so much money. And I was like, how am I going to pay my $7,000 in student loan? So then I was like, okay, I'm going to apply to grad school. And then by the time I graduate, the $7,000 will be like nothing. And so it was true. By the time I was done, it was like 1998, $7,000. I'm like, I could afford that. But we were so poor. Anyway, we were poor growing up. And so we didn't have money, right? And so, yeah, that's my answer. To wait for inflation to kick in. Someone want to answer the question of David Mai?
How often?
Yeah. Sorry, the conclusion to that question is, Ciara, I hope you become a professor.
How often do your research inform each other's works? Perhaps I see it through outer proximity and distance, with Celine's work with intimacy, power, and film, Rhacel's research on distance in women's familial care and work, and Juno's examination of human animal relations. That's true. Can you talk more about how your work may have influenced each other?
I think one of the main ways our work influences each other is how we are able to survive and take care of ourselves in the academy through each other's help,
Yeah, totally.
By each other, like this makes sense, and what are you reading? I think those are 2 ways that we help each other and influence each other.
Yeah. Yeah, that is actually true. We actually do read sentences, and we read abstracts.
Yes.
Like it's often over text message. It's like the worst medium.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I just sent you one of those the other day. This is sentence. But I think we're out of time. It's 7
Yeah,
p.m.
we are. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are we going to take a picture?
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Giselle. Thank you for having us.
So Tita Linda wasn't here at all.
So Tita Linda didn't make it, but I just want to say on behalf of Tita Linda and Philippine Expressions, and of course FilAM Arts, Happy International Women's Day!
Thank you so much for having us.
No, it's not very often that you get three knowledgeable, intellectual sisters that you don't only see the work that you guys do, but you also see how you relate to one another as women and as sisters. And so I just want to say on behalf of the organizations FilAM Arts and Philippine Expressions, thank you for leading the way for a lot of us Filipinas that are looking to get into academics. And just that, you know, it makes me so proud to be Pinay because of all the work that you guys do.
I know
Thank you.
Yeah, it's so wonderful
Thank
to
you.
see. It's so wonderful to see how everyone's complimenting us on our intellect, but I think there's a shortage of compliments on our beauty. So,
I have to go, guys.
So Filipino.
Bye. Bye.
All right. Thank you so much, Rhacel.
thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Thanks.
Dr. Celine and Dr. Juno, for being here. I really appreciate the time, Dr. Juno. And I just want to say on behalf of Philippine Expressions Bookshop, I'm sorry Tita Linda Nietes couldn't be here this evening, but I do want to say that, you know, this virtual Pinay Gathering is in celebration of International Women's History Day, which is an event that has been celebrated around the world on this 8th day of March. And for the last 25 years, Philippine Expressions Bookshop has really been celebrating the month of March with Pinay gatherings as a tribute to women authors, as well as, people in our community. So in 1984, Tita Linda Nietes Little founded Philippine Expressions Bookshop, and you can practically count the number of Pinay authors in the community with your 10 fingers, she says. But in 1996, when the bookshop had gained its footing in the community, she decided to gather Pinay friends to enjoy some camaraderie and at the same time encourage them to come out of the woodwork, so to speak, and make something out of their lives. And so she wanted to give them moral support through Philippine Expressions. And since she knew that they were budding writers in the group, she concentrated on them. What started as a simple lunch and gathering evolved into an annual event where she presented book talks and conversations with authors and scholars and other literary soirees. So this year, it's the 25th anniversary. They will celebrate in a big way by presenting these 3 virtual book talks on 3 different dates in March. And this is their way of paying tribute to the presence of Pinay authors in our midst, whose numbers have quadrupled over the years. So through Pinay gatherings and book talks, they have presented free to the public. They are able to make Pinay authors more visible and have created literary awareness among members in the community. At the same time, they've made the Filipino presence more visible among mainstream Americans. She definitely looks forward to the day when books by Pinay and Pinay authors, as well as Pinoy authors, will be part of the family budget, and that books will be purchased regularly. The Filipino families in the US will maintain a library of Philippine books in their home, not only for themselves, but for their children. And so I want to invite all of you to the events that are happening at Philippine Expressions Bookshop this month in May. This is going to be presented by FilAM Arts as well, in collaboration, obviously, with Philippine Expressions Bookshop. So please mark your calendars if you can. We have a Filipino Food Connections event, as well as another event, and we're going to show that that poster in just a little bit. But we just want to say thank you so much for joining us today. And we're sorry that Tita Linda Nietes could not join us because of some technical difficulties, but Please mark your calendar on Friday, March 26th, The Delicate Strength of My Grandmother, featuring Gabriella Dansley with her book, Sally's Crocodile. It's going to be in conversation with Jocelyn Francisco. And it's really the life and art of Araceli Limcaco Dance. And then also join us for the event that's also happening this March for Pinay Gathering. And this is also going to be streaming here on Facebook through FilAM Arts and Philippine Expressions Bookshop. And this is an event that you don't want to miss, because Nicole Ponseca of Jeepney, who has a restaurant in New York City, is going to be joining us. She is the author of I Am a Filipino, together with Delina Benavente and Malu Perez Nivera. So please join us for these two events. Maraming salamat po. On behalf of FilAM Arts, my name is Giselle Tongi Walters. Maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat.